Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the Juniper Center Thrive Live, where we have conversations with guests to help clinicians and really pretty much everybody about mental health. We want to normalize conversations about mental health. We want people to feel comfortable talking about mental health. We all really need to be talking about mental health. So welcome. Glad you could join us today. So today's show is a little bit different. We're doing something different than we've done historically. We actually have 3 guests today. I'm so grateful and appreciative of them showing up. Unfortunately, there is always something in the news to make this topic really relevant and important. So today we're going to be exploring Black men and mental health. And we're going to look at themes related to things like code switching, vulnerability, and the ever-pervasive stigma around mental health. So at the Juniper Center, we have a genuine, true commitment to diversity. It's part of our mission of helping people. We want people to live their best lives. We appreciate how important it is for mental health to find one's voice and to embrace a first person voice when we're talking about different experiences. And so to that end, I'm really thrilled to have this particular panel today. Often I'm the one who drives the conversation. That's not going to be happening today. I'm going to be stepping back a bit, listening, learning from the folks who are really generously giving their time today to talk about promoting good mental health, especially for Black men. So let me tell you about today's guest. First of all, thank you to Dr. Thames, who is returning today. She's a licensed clinical psychologist. She's a member of our team at the Juniper Center, and also the founder of the EPIC Foundation, which has the mission to impact people living with invisible chronic illnesses. She also leads our Juniper Center Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and we're very appreciative. So before I turn this over to Karen, I also want to introduce Henri Ternier. Being a French person, I want to make sure I say that properly, Henri. I hopped on and called you Henry, but it's Henri. Let me introduce Keenen Stevenson. We're thrilled that Keenen has recently joined our team. Thrilled at the Juniper Center. He's a licensed clinical social worker and social justice advocate, and he's going to lead our conversation today. So Karen, please tell us a little more about Henri, and I understand you have a special connection to him.
I sure do. I'm so excited today. First of all, Margot, or Dr. Margot, thank you for having me today. And I'm super excited to have this person join us. This person happens to be my nephew. So shout out to my nephew who's sitting right here. I'm so excited. So Henri also goes by Henry, so he answers to both pronunciations, which is a fun fact. My nephew, Henry, is a licensed professional counselor. He has his own private practice in Pittsburgh called Think Better Therapy. So I'm so proud. He's been practicing for several years. He does individual and couples work, and right now Henry is doing hybrid work, so he does some in-person work as well as telehealth work. And also Henry has a podcast that I want all of you to tune into. I'm gonna say it's called Stuff Your Therapist Says, but
Stuff with a different spelling that begins with an S and ends with a T, right?
That's right, SH and then ends with a T. But it's really awesome. They, they do this podcast in order to humanize therapists. Oftentimes, we don't have sort of a human image to our clients. And so he does that. I'm really excited to have you here, Henry. Thank you so much for joining us. I think you might be on mute.
I apologize for that. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an exciting opportunity to be here and talk about Black men and mental health. I'm really excited.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Very thrilled to have you, and I love that you two have that connection. So Keenen, I'm going to be turning this over to you, but Karen, Dr. Karen came to me with the idea of doing this show and really shining a spotlight, not just today, but like this is just a kickoff of really shining a spotlight, especially after we heard about Stephen Twitch boss, committing suicide or having a suicide. I'm always struggling a little bit with that language, and just how it came so out of the blue, and bringing really to the forefront how invisible this issue can be, that men are struggling, people are struggling. We'll start with that. People are struggling. I think men struggle differently in some ways, and then certainly men of color. It just, the stigma seems to be heaped one atop the other. So that was really how this situation not came to light, but I think it kind of spawned the idea of having a show dedicated to Black men and mental health. So at this point, if anybody doesn't know about this, and if you're out there watching today, a lot of folks watch after the fact, please say a quick hello in the comment section. You can ask a question, make a comment, just even a hello. We would love to know that you're there. That's always wonderful. But if you don't know much about that, Stephen Twitch boss was a very well-known, very well-liked dancer, entertainer who came to fame through So You Think You Can Dance, and did a lot of philanthropy, and took his own life in, was it December? I'm thinking it was in December. And so it just was so stunning to folks. But this happens every day, right? I mean, it was just like, oh, here's a famous person to whom this has happened. This is happening all the time. This is happening every day. So that was really what got this show moving. So Keenen, you work in mental health, obviously, and you identify as a Black man. Hello, Gloria. Thanks for being here today. So glad you're here. Nice to see you. So, no one can speak for an entire group of people, but I hoped we could just kind of kick off the conversation with you by framing this topic of Black men and mental health. So I'm going to turn this over to you just to get our conversation going.
No, and thank you for such a warm introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here. So when I think about mental health in general, and I think about men in general, like I think about how men are taught, like, and this is like heteronormative speak. We are taught to, you work, you do this, you don't complain, you don't express yourself, you continue to go forth. And then, when at the end of the day, you can try to relax and do something. And I think like it becomes problematic because when I think about Black men and representation, oftentimes as a Black man, you really don't get to see what like appropriate coping looks like from time to time. Like we think about that in general, where it's like, you can't, like I said, I'm not speaking for all people, but I think about my lived experience, and I think about my father. He was really good at like teaching me how to cope and have emotional intelligence. And I'm really thankful for him and my mother for that capacity. But I know that that's not everyone's lived experience. And I used to be a teacher, and I always used to talk to my students about how to express yourself in a capacity where you don't bottle things up inside and then you explode, because the explosions or like I tell people it's either you're going to externally explode or internally explode. And for me, it's really hard to see that, because anyone who, dies by suicide is tough. And then thinking about it from the connection of people look at him like husband, father on TV, smiling, dancing, DJing, all these things, entrepreneur. And at the end of the day, he was still sad. And he was still lonely. And regardless, I tell people loneliness, it does not necessarily reflect your external environment. Loneliness is something internal. And you can have everything outside of you, but then if you feel a certain way inside, it really impacts you in a way. And so when I'm thinking about this now, Henry, I think about your podcast. Mm-hmm. I think about you and your co-host, and your co-host is an ally. And I think about Black men mental health. And I think about the intersections of, race, gender relations, and the nuance of everything. When you talk about topics in your podcast or just in your work in general, what are some of the themes that you're noticing?
Well, especially when I work with men, a lot of the themes I've worked on with them is emotional intelligence and being able to safely be vulnerable, recognizing, people and environments where we can be emotionally safe. Because a lot of times the men that I work with, especially Black men, do not feel safe being vulnerable even in their own homes. And so we've recognized that it's a real problem that pervades every aspect of society. And a lot of what we see is society sending a certain message to men, and especially Black men in particular, because from what I've noticed in my work, we have somewhat of a warped view of what strength is, especially in the Black community.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Sorry about that. I think that is, really important to think about in regards to Black men and mental health. And you bring up some issues that we often do not think about in our community and communities at large. So I wanted to introduce the concept of code switching. And code switching, for those of you who don't know, can sort of be defined as being two versions of oneself, and or feeling like two versions of oneself. And that is, having a certain presentation and language and behavior in one environment, and feeling like you can be yourself in another environment. And oftentimes people think of it as having to put on a certain presentation of oneself in an oppressive environment, or an environment where your particular culture, or certain intersections do not matter, or maybe are not accepted. So I wanted to ask both you, Keenen and Henry, what your experiences of code switching have been. I know for me as a Black woman, I have had experiences with it, and I could go on and on about it. But, just in terms of, yes, I do feel like I can be my authentic self in a lot of ways, but in some ways I'm more relaxed in my home environment, or with my friends, or with my family. And so I wanted to check in with the both of you to see what your experiences have been with this, and how it's defined in your lives as Black men. We'll start with Henry.
Sure. So my personal experience with code switching is very interesting because, in doing this work, we learn that not every Black individual experience is the same. And, the way that I'm speaking now is how I usually speak. And sometimes this actually throws people off, whether they are a person of color, or they're, or they're white. And it's mainly because, in my personal experience, my parents aren't from this country, as you know, Dr. Karen. My parents immigrated here from Haiti, and what they wanted was for myself and my brother to assimilate to the culture and the environment around me. And so one of the things that was not really encouraged was AAVE, African American Vernacular, I believe, vernacular expression. And so a lot of people find it off-putting when I speak to them this way casually, when it sounds like I'm just trying to be professional all the time. And so we see that I have to code switch to depending on the environment in order to make sure that people around me feel comfortable. And I feel that it is somewhat of an unspoken obligation that a lot of people of color, and especially Black people, have to essentially take onto their shoulders, because they don't know if just speaking the way that they normally do would put other people ill at ease.
Wow. Yeah, I think this is a really important thing that we're talking about. And thank you to Forzone for being here, Megan Porterman. I can't quite see what that is. Francisca? No. Can someone see how to pronounce that name? Thank you. And Elizabeth Berlin, thank you. So lots of folks are watching today and are expressing appreciation for you all being here. But that idea of code switching, and where can you be your genuine, authentic self? and that there's an expectation that you show up in one environment this way and another environment there. And I'm sitting back here thinking, I can imagine people are, white folks are thinking, well, don't we all do that? But I think this is different. It's different. Like you have your professional self and your personal self, but this is different. This is it okay? Is it acceptable? Will you be thought of in some kind of negative way? Not like, well, I'm a little more relaxed here and I'm more professional. It's like you could be thought of in a negative way if you're not potentially doing that code switching. Is that correct?
Yes, I would definitely say that that's correct. A lot of times people, people naturally make judgments. We have, internal biases. We have ideas about people before we even know them. And so when we encounter them, depending on how they speak, we can easily draw conclusions about who this person is, even if it's not necessarily a fair conclusion.
That's great. So, yeah, I think, one of the things that you're getting at is, when we talk about the stress for men and Black men, men of color, and mental health, that code switching is just an extra stressor. So we're talking about layers. So can you speak to some of those other layers that folks are dealing with?
I think one of those layers is, trying to navigate what is an appropriate outward response to have to certain situations, going beyond just, Steven Twitch Boss. I think that one of the issues regarding emotional expression, especially with Black men, is historically we've seen our negative emotions be used against us. We've definitely seen our anger, our frustration, even our sadness seen as something of a threat to other people. And so a lot of times we find ourselves having to bottle up our emotions, especially our negative emotions, due to it's essentially a survival instinct, because in many ways we have learned that our anger and our distress is seen as dangerous by society.
Right. So, right. Just a normal emotion. You just don't get to have it because you will be the angry Black man or the angry Black woman. And that is then therefore dangerous. Oh my gosh. So Keenen, it sounds like you have a story about a 16-year-old boy. Is that accurate?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So like I said previously, I used to be a science teacher. And a lot of my students, I wish I could say his name. He might be watching, but he means so much to me because the growth that he had as a person. I met him as a freshman, and the way he expressed himself, he said, "I never watched a Black man express anger before in a way like you." I think about, to piggyback off what Henry said, disposition and temperament also play a factor into what people do. I think about me, like I'm Black. I can't rinse my skin color off. I think about like code switching, and I think about a lot of the kids now that I've worked with there now in predominantly white institutions, and they talk about feeling as if they're invisible, or they feel as if they are the object of everyone's eye. And so in particular with him, it's just like he never seen people be vulnerable and ask questions and tell someone like, hey, I'm not having a good day, because he was always taught, you go to work, you block it out. When everyone goes to sleep, then you have your moment to yourself to figure that out. And then we talked about like the health of like, what does that look like and what does that teach you? And I think about like generational vulnerability, where it's like, I never watched my father do that. My father never watched his father do that. If I become a father, then I'm going to express myself like that. I have a 3-year-old son now, and I watch my dad communicate to his family and talk about things with me as his son, of course, on how to operate as a person in society, especially as a Black man. And then I think about like when he talked about code switching, my dad is, for context, He's in his 70s and he's from the deep South. And so like his perception of reality is really interesting because you would think he would have a certain mindset, and he's a complete opposite. My father always told me, he said, Keenen, he's like, he's a big fro. He's had it like my whole life. And he says, you cannot make yourself more palatable to people. And I'm paraphrasing it, of course, by changing your outward appearance, because if someone doesn't like you, they just don't like you because of the color of your skin. And so he said, you never cut your hair. And I'm like, cool. I don't cut my hair. And if someone and I have it, like if someone doesn't like it, that's okay. That place is not meant for me. And what I seen that for my students, they saw me as a role model. Because typically you ask them, hey, who do you like? They're like, oh, I love Steph Curry, I love LeBron James. They're like, Mr. Stevenson, you're cool, but you're not rich. And I'm just like, you're right. I'm a teacher. You're right. I'm not rich at all.
Oh, I'm not rich.
And like for that to kind of see, it doesn't always necessarily have to be maybe a direct family member when you're like expressing vulnerability, but someone that they can relate to and see. That has been one of the things that I've been looking at, and like how, like even just my work with like young Black men, teens in their in therapy, it's just like, oh, you're not that bad. You're actually pretty cool for a therapist. And I take that, I'm like, okay. I feel like I like that a lot. Thank you. That meant a lot to me because it's showing you there's another way. And then I like, Henry, what you talked about, like you being Haitian. And like when you think about Black people or African Americans, there's so much diversity within the Black community.
Yep.
Like, and so people like, well, this person, like I'm a person like, oh, they're Black. And they're like, no, I'm Nigerian. There's a difference. And just understanding like you're not going to take my cultural heritage and lump that in. And I get it from the concept of like not being disrespectful, as they like, no, this is who I am. And so I really appreciate you like sharing that, where it's like, I'm from the Midwest. Our vernacular is very different. And you know, when you think about switching within maneuvering societies, like I tell people, my vernacular changes, but not my person, because I change how I speak with my parents,
Yep.
with my friends, and professionally. And it's just like, but I never change my diction and delivery, because for me, that's who I am. I talk with emotion and convey myself in a certain way. And so Henry, like now as we're transitioning, and like I want to like ask a question about vulnerability, and why do you think vulnerability is like a hard thing for like Black men to express, and then for society to even see Black men be vulnerable? Because they'll tell you, I heard kids say, I ain't never seen a Black man cry. I'm like, I've seen one if you step on a piece of glass. But then they say, oh, that's pain. But it's like, what about emotion? And it's just like, what is your experience in looking at Black men be emotional, and how do you support them in their efforts to really find themselves?
Well, one of the things that I've been doing, especially when I work with younger Black men, is getting them to familiarize themselves with what emotions are. A lot of times we, as men in general, but definitely Black men, we're introduced to the concept of emotions we're introduced to 3 specific emotions that are essentially appropriate to display in most situations, because that's what is expected of us. And those are, of course, jovialness, happiness, anger, and occasionally frustration. But unfortunately, a lot of young Black men don't recognize the other emotions. And so one of the things that I do is expand their emotional vocabulary and help them recognize times that they've experienced things like, being perplexed, being content, feeling actual fear, and recognizing that feeling fear is a natural phenomenon, and it's not an indicator that you're weak. Recognizing that, and this is something I tell to all of my clients, that our emotions are actually calls to positive action, and they're not something to run away from, but rather they are opportunities to respond in a positive way. And so once a lot of my clients, especially my Black male clients, recognize that, they understand that, if I'm feeling sad, this encourages me to seek comfort. This doesn't mean that I have to bottle it up and keep it inside until I find something to distract myself from it. Because a lot of times we find that Black men tend to run away from their emotions because they're seen as nuisances. when in reality, emotion is what gives life its color. You know, we experience the full spectrum of life if we experience our emotions. And so just getting to a point where vulnerability isn't seen as a weakness, that is the main thing that I focus on with my Black clients.
Oh, I love that. And from Four Zone Healing, they said, yes, relatable. It's why people can gravitate to some types of help and not others. So can you all speak to that about how do we invite people? And thank you, Deanna, from Intercultural Talk, about loving that framing, which I agree with, Henri. I think that was a great frame. How would you invite Black men in particular, or men of color, into getting help, right? Because it sounds like, right, they're going to gravitate toward potentially some kind of help and, you know, not be interested in others. How do we collectively invite people in?
I think part of it is, you know, putting the information out there that there are male therapists. We do know that, you know, in the realm of psychology and therapy, it is a women-dominated field, which isn't a bad thing at all. But I think that one of the things that I've encountered in my personal practice is that a lot of times, a lot of men tend to gravitate towards male clinicians, or away from the idea entirely, because they want to speak to men and they're essentially afraid to be vulnerable in front of women, mainly due to, you know, what society tells them about being vulnerable in front of women and their own personal experience being vulnerable in front of women.
Yeah, boy, that makes so much sense. So we have a question of how can therapists provide support without giving the impression that we're trying to encourage more code switching? Great question. Or acculturating into a culture that's not their own. That's a great question. And, you know, especially as someone who is not a person of color, right, being an ally as a therapist, I mean, how do we invite people in and not, you know, sort of suggest that people need to do more code switching, or that it's not okay for them to be vulnerable?
I think part of that is, you know, having a sense of curiosity when it comes to encountering a culture that's not our own, and, you know, outwardly expressing that is welcome, you know, being willing to learn about what this person's culture is and understand who they are as a person, and see them as more than just, you know, the color of their skin or the accent that they may speak in. You know, a lot of times I have worked with individuals who are not of the same race as me. I've worked with people from different Asian cultures, from different Latin cultures, and by being open to hearing about their culture, by being curious as to what certain things mean to them, how things are expressed in their individual cultures, we let them know that, you know, it's a welcome environment. They're welcome to be themselves in our practice.
Yeah, one other, you know, it's purely from an ally perspective. So my kids are mixed race, and my older son saw a couple of white therapists at one point, you know, social workers at school, who were saying things like, well, you know, because my son would talk about his fear of being a Black man in this world, in this climate, because he hears what's going on the news, and he had a lot of anxiety about driving, he was driving for Uber Eats, going into the city of Chicago, and, you know, some of the things he was hearing. And the white, very well-meaning social workers would say, well, are you sure? I mean, does that happen to everybody? Is that something you really need to worry about? So I wonder about, believe people about their fears. If somebody is scared, don't try to talk them out of it, right? That is totally their experience. And I don't think we do people any favor or saying, well, I'm not like that, and I know lots of people who wouldn't treat you that way. That is not okay. And fortunately, we were able to find a very lovely, brilliant African-American male therapist in his 30s who's perfect for him. You know, and that worked really well for him, because he really needed to hear some of those experiences and have it be validated. Like, yup, these things are real. Yup, these things happen. Hopefully it's not going to happen to you, and here's how you can, you know, maybe protect yourself. But but it's real. So in addition to knowing about the culture and being curious, believing that people's experiences are their experiences, and that's valid, and their worries are their worries, and it's not just, something that they're pulling out of thin air. So Keenen and Henri, what have we not asked yet? And Karen, what have we not yet covered that seems important to share with people?
I definitely think it's important for Henry to talk about his podcast, because this is that's his platform, and I'm just like, okay, like I really want to hear more about that, and then so you can just really just gain more listeners, because what you're doing, I ain't gonna lie, I listen to some stuff, so and I thought it was really good. So like your platform, like what is your platform for, and what does your platform represent for you as a Black clinician and just a person in the profession in general?
I appreciate the question. Yeah, I run a podcast with a former colleague of mine and a very good friend of mine. His name is Corbin Linville. He is also a clinician. And it is called Stuff Your Therapist Says. At the beginning of every episode, there's a disclaimer where I apologize to my mother because of the foul language. So I will not say the name of the podcast, but you can definitely find it. It starts with an S, ends with a T, and there's an exclamation point somewhere in there. But the podcast is simply two clinicians humanizing clinicians. We talk about mental health, we talk about therapy, we talk about, we try to educate our listeners on the different nuances and terminology and jargon that is involved in the practice of therapy. But we also humanize ourselves by talking about the things that anybody else would talk about. We would talk about current events. But we also add, especially in our later episodes, we've added a fun segment where we take fictional characters and we talk about their experience in their fictional world and apply mental health there. And so, for example, we've talked about Harry Potter, the boy who lived, and his personal experience, possibly talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, considering what he witnessed as a child. We've also talked about the Incredible Hulk and talking about intermittent explosive disorder and how these things actually exist even in the realm of fiction, and how the idea of mental health and combating mental illness pervades every aspect of our society.
I love that. And Henri, as we move around and take final words from everyone, is there, it's so hard to encapsulate into one sentence or something, but what would your number one recommendation be for those of us who want to support Black men and mental health? And I'm going to tune into your podcast, by the way, but what's just one thing you can even think of? I love that perspective. That's so great. I love the Incredible Hulk. That's great.
I appreciate that. I would say empathy. When we are clinicians, we're speaking to lots of different people, and we may not have the same experiences. But if we can empathize with the people that come in for help, we can at least start perspective taking, try to put ourselves in their shoes. I may not have the same experience as you, but I do experience a lot of the same emotions as you do. And a lot of the experiences that you have sound frightening to me, sound encouraging to me, sound worrying to me. And I can at least understand that if I were in your shoes, perhaps I'd be feeling the same way. And so you're not unhuman or inhuman for feeling the way that you do.
Just normalizing those feelings. Yeah, I love that. Wonderful, Henri. Thank you so much. Keenen, what would you say in terms of a really like your number one takeaway for us about how we can support Black men and mental health?
Just to echo, normalizing the ambivalence, and also understanding that even though I'm a Black man, I'm not the expert of all Black people. And having other people understand that they're not the expert of someone else's lived experience. If I can humble myself and be like, I have no idea that what your experience is like because I've never experienced that, but let me learn and be inquisitive. And I think that being inquisitive and having an opportunity to want to learn and tell the person they're the expert of their life, because I'm big on like empowerment, really is a big thing, because it gives that person agency and feel like they're in control, where they might feel helpless in other capacities. They know that they're in control of their mental health in the space.
I love that. They're in control of their mental health in that space. That's wonderful. And right, none of us are the experts on anybody else. None of us are, no matter what. And such a good reminder. Thank you so much. Dr. Karen, how about you? One thing you can think of in terms of a way we can really support Black men in mental health?
Absolutely. I appreciate having this conversation and having our, guests here as well. I believe that using your voice empowers us, silence disempowers us. And so continuing these conversations is vitally important. So let's keep talking. That's really important.
I love that. Well, I would love for us all to keep talking. I would love if we could do this again, but like half an hour or 35 minutes is nothing. Gloria, thank you so much. I'm glad you were here today. And I'm so appreciative of all of you being here. And I know everyone's time is valuable. I would love it if we could do this again, where we can continue the conversation, because I feel like we just like cracked open the door a little bit and stuck our noses in. And there's so much to talk about. Renee, thank you for being here. So thank you all. Thank you, Keenen, Stevenson, Henri, Ternier, Dr. Karen Thames. Very much appreciate all of you. Please go listen to Henri's podcast. And it is, I'm going to say it, everybody, so be aware, shit your therapist says. So, is that right? I mean, that's essentially it. I love it.
That is correct. Shit your therapist.
Right. And we do say some shit. So there you have it. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you so much for being our panelists. We will reconvene again so we can continue this conversation. It's critical, critical, critical. So thank you all. We do this the first Friday of every month. We will look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everyone. Be well.